In this video, I'm going to teach you how to make a ball. This video covers the standard 32-piece ball design, which is this one here, but all of the same rules and skills apply to some of the more complex ball constructions you can see behind me. Everything you need to get started is in this video. I'm going to go over all of the basic tools that you'll need, talk you through every step of the process, and share all of the little tips and tricks I've picked up in my years of exploring the medium of ball. There's links to everything you need to get in the description. Ball making is a very rewarding hobby. It's very quick to pick up, and anyone can do it. If you follow the steps in this video in a few hours, you'll have your very own ball in front of you. So without further ado, let's get started. Before we get started, there's a few things you'll need. First, starting with some basic tools. You'll need some stitching needles. I like to use smaller needles, I find them easier to stitch with, but that's mostly down to personal preference. You'll need 2 minimum, but it's not uncommon to break a needle, so to be safe you probably want to grab a few more. You'll need some thread to stitch the ball together. I use this 1mm waxed stitching thread. You will need a ball bladder. For the first 2 years of ball making, I would just destroy other balls and recycle the ball bladder for each new ball I made. One ball had to die for a new ball to live. I found a factory that would sell me some, but they had a minimum order quantity of 1,000. I eventually just decided to suck it up and buy 1,000, then sell the extras on my website. I've tried a lot of different ball bladders, and these are my favourite. They're made of wrapped rubber, and a well-stitched ball with one of these inside can compete with some $170 match balls used in professional leagues. You'll need some fabric glue. This is used to hold the ball bladder in place inside the ball before it's pumped up.
Ball pump.
You will need a ball pump, for obvious reasons. You'll need some way of pumping up the ball when it's done. You'll need some scissors or snips. And if you're making the panels yourself, you'll need to grab a 6mm hole punch. This is to create the hole in one of the panels where the ball bladder valve will poke through. You'll also need some sort of hammer or something to hit it with. You will need a way of creating the ball panels. The easiest way to do all this is to buy one of my self-contained Maker Ball kits, which I sell on my website. These come with everything you need to make your first ball, including some pre-cut panels, a ball bladder, some glue, some needles and thread. If you don't want to do that though, I've published some free patterns on the Ball Makers Guild, something that's worth checking out if you want to get into the hobby of ball making. The Ball Makers Guild has a growing library of ball patterns, including a lot from my previous videos, and I'm adding more all the time. Each pattern includes a printable template that's sized for both US letter and A4 paper. So all you need to do is print them out, cut the panel shapes out of leather, and punch the stitching holes where the pattern indicates. There's also an SVG path for every pattern that you can use if you have access to a laser cutter, but that's definitely not needed if you're just getting started. There's also a Discord channel filled with ball makers from around the world who might be able to help you if you get stuck. If you plan to make the same ball over and over again, it could be worth investing in some ball dies. You'll need to get a press like this. This one was $150 on Amazon, and a set of dies for the ball that you want to create. I occasionally sell these through my website, but you can also get your own made using the patterns that I published in the Ball Makers Guild. Just search custom leather dies and there'll be options. Something that I'd highly recommend is adding a layer of foam to the back of your panels. I'll link to the foam that I use in the description. This layer helps with the shape and feel of the finished ball. It's not completely necessary, but if you go to the trouble of adding this layer, your finished ball will be more round and will have a nicer feel to play with later. You can pretty much use anything to make your ball panels. Anything that's strong enough to hold a stitch anyway. I've made balls out of all sorts of stuff. Money, hose pipe, dishcloth, old football boots. The material that I use most though is leather. It comes in all different colours, different feels, different textures and thicknesses. There's a few websites that I use that I'll link in the description. It's worth checking to see if you have a tannery close by that you can visit and walk around. I personally really enjoy walking around, touching different materials, trying to imagine how they would work in ball form. One thing that's important to note is that the thickness of the material will affect the size of the panels you need to create. All of my patterns are created for panels that are 1.2 to 1.5mm thick, which is a common leather thickness and a good balance between strength and weight. If you deviate too much from this thickness, you might run into issues when you pump the ball up. There's a few other tools that aren't necessary, but might be worth grabbing at some point. A pair of flathead pliers can be handy. Sometimes the stitching needles can be a bit fiddly to pull through, and having some pliers in grabbing distance will make things easier. A stitching pony, that's one of these things. This is totally optional. I have a few of these, including this really fancy one that you literally sit on and fully ride. But the one I find myself coming back to and using the most often is this simple clip. Any clip is fine. Its sole purpose is just to hold the two pieces of leather together whilst you're stitching. A screwdriver. I love this little nest one. The flathead is the perfect size to fit between two stitching holes in the pattern that I've published. This can be useful to clean up any accidental messy stitching and poking in the last stitch. Now you've got all of the stuff that you need, we're ready to get stitching. We're going to use a stitch called a saddle stitch to stitch the ball together, and if done correctly it should create some nice clean lines between your panels. It requires one piece of thread with needles on both ends. Pull out a length of thread and cut it. Carefully thread one of the ends. The best way I've found to do this is to pull the end of the thread against the end of the needle. This will create a very clean point which makes it easier to thread through the eye of the needle. Once you get it through, turn the needle around and thread it back through the same thread. This is a quick way to thread a needle, and it's something that you'll be doing a lot of over the next few hours, so it's worth doing the quick way. Do this with both ends of your thread, then we'll be ready for the first stitch. I'm going to start by grabbing the pentagon that has the hole in it for the ball bladder. Then build a flower of hexagons around that. So grab your pentagon with a hole in it, and then one of the hexagon panels. Line them up so that they're face to face. This is a little counterintuitive at first, but after you're done stitching they will be folded back to reveal a nice clean line between the two panels, and the stitching line will be hidden completely inside the ball. If you have one, put these two panels in the jaws of your pony, or hold them together in whatever clip that you're using. It's possible to do without this, like I said, it's just a bit more fiddly. Make sure that your stitching holes across the two panels are lined up, then put one of the needles through the hole closest to the corner that you're going to start stitching from. Pull both needles above your head to find the middle between the two needles. This is just a quick way to find the half point in the thread. Take one of the needles and put it halfway through the first empty hole next to the corner that you started from. Take the other needle and put it back through the same hole from the other side of the panel, being careful not to stab yourself. Once both needles have passed each other, pull them through all the way, making sure that there's no slack in the line and that the stitch is tight. Then do the same thing on the next empty hole. And again, and again. What you're doing here is a saddle stitch. Each needle weaves back and forth between each side of both panels. They alternate, which creates a very strong stitch. Get used to this motion. You'll be doing it a lot if you get into ball making. Keep going until you reach the end of the edge you're stitching towards. When you do get to the corner, make sure everything is pulled through tight. Then go back one stitch, doubling up the stitch on the last two holes. Take the two needles and tie the ends of the thread together into a double knot over the edge of the two panels. Now you can peel back your two panels and reveal the first part of your future ball. Grab the next hexagon and line it up face to face again, edge to edge. This panel will be added to the ball largely in the same way as I just showed you, but with one key difference. It has two edges that will be attached to the ball, so we'll need to stitch around a corner, which is a core concept that you'll need to understand. Start out the exact same way that you did previously and head towards the corner that you'll need to stitch around. And wheel the needles through next to each other. You want to thread this needle through the top hole of the edge that you've previously stitched together. So rather than just jumping straight to this hole, through the top stitch in this other edge. So in this case, it's here. What this does is, when you pull this tight, it brings all three of the panels tightly close together and creates a nice tight corner stitch. The thread is coming out on the back of this new panel where you want to continue stitching from. You're ready to continue the stitch. So now first hole of this new edge comes through the first hole in this edge. Then you can keep going and tie the thread off in the same way that you did before once you reach the end of the edge. Now you'll really start to get a sense of what the ball's going to be like. The consistency of your tension in the thread is an important thing to be aware of. If you don't pull the thread through with the same tension for all of the panels, when you pump up your finished ball, some of the seams may be more defined than others. The easiest way to stay consistent is to pull the thread tight after every few stitches. Don't pull it too hard though, or you could rip the material between your stitching holes, but you still can pull it pretty hard. Just by repeating everything I've taught you so far, you should be able to go ahead and complete your first flower. A flower is just one pentagon surrounded by hexagons. And if you have any trouble with the construction, you can reference any picture of any 32 panel ball, which should be easy to find. The key thing is that each pentagon should have a ring of hexagons surrounding them, and no two pentagons should touch. If you follow these two rules and keep adding panels, a ball will start to form in front of you. The first flower. You can really kind of start to see the ball coming together. Now, basically, more pentagons, like this. Hexagons, another row of hexagons, and then we can put the ball bladder in. So, I guess I'll just carry on. This is halfway, officially halfway. I'm 2 or 3 hours in and yeah, this is what the halfway point looks like. You can really start to feel the ball come together at this point. It's literally half a ball. So my plan now is I'm going to add one more ring of panels around this and then put the ball bladder in. The further into the ball you get, the more fiddly some of the stitching starts to become, especially on these second and third edges when you have to kind of bend panels around and try and line up the edges before you stitch them. It's getting to the point now where it's a little tricky to pierce both panels with the needle and then pushing the other needle back through the other way. So it's around this point where I start changing my stitching style slightly. I call this stepping through the stitch. Rather than trying to put both needles through at the same time, you just take one needle, put it through the side of the panel that it would normally go through, but don't put it all the way through this time, just leave it there. Then you take the other needle and put that through the other side of the other panel that you want to pierce. This time, pulling it through, but leaving some slack in the thread like this. Then bring this needle over to the other needle and following the path that the thread would usually take, put that needle through the other side of the panel and pull it partly through. Now you can pull this other needle through because it's past that other needle and you've charted a course for the thread that doesn't intersect with the thread coming back the other direction. Now take this needle and put it back through the hole that the other needle came through. There's one thing you want to be super careful of. This needle is going through the same hole that this thread previously just got poked through. And the thing you want to avoid is piercing this thread with this needle as you go through. A good way to check that you're not doing that is to hold some of the slack in this thread and pull it through back the other way as you put the needle through. So like this. Doing that makes sure that you're not piercing the thread with the needle as you put it through. If it does pierce the thread, pulling the needle through makes it very obvious and it's easy to fix at this point. If you do happen to pull the needle through whilst threading this thread as you're coming back, you'll create a tangled mess and you'll likely have to unpick this whole panel and do it again. So you want to be careful. So that is the same as doing one stitch the last way that I showed you. Put one needle halfway through one of the stitching holes, grab the other needle, put it through the other panel, this time pulling it partially through whilst leaving some slack in the line. Now put that needle past the other needle that's half poking out, pull them both through. Again, leaving some slack in the line so you have something to grab onto. Now this needle goes back through the hole that the other needle came through whilst pulling the slack in the thread. And again, that's just to make sure that you don't accidentally pierce this thread with this needle as you're coming through the hole. Once both needles are through, you can pull it tight. That's stepping through the stitch. The deeper into the ball you get, the more likely it is that you'll have to do this, just because you run out of space and it gets more and more fiddly to do a proper saddle stitch. The exact moment you put the ball bladder in is down to personal preference. It's worth noting though that after you put the ball bladder in, you'll need to be a bit more careful with the stitches. One mistake or slip can damage the ball bladder, which can be very annoying, especially if it happens right before you're finished. These ball bladders come sort of like very deflated. There's no air in this at all right now. And if you're not careful, pushing through one of these nozzles without lifting up the other side of the ball bladder, that can happen, which has now completely ruined this ball bladder. It's put a massive hole in it, so it will never pump up. Before gluing the ball bladder into the ball, I like to pre-pump it up and then release the air. I do this for two reasons. The first is just to make sure that there's no issues with the ball bladder before you spend time stitching inside. It's also good to carefully unstick the ball bladder from itself. What we're going to do now is glue this ball bladder inside the ball. You want it to line up with this hole perfectly without kind of scraping the glue around the hole inside of the ball. What I've started doing is basically threading a needle through this little black bit and then putting the needle through this hole first and pulling it through. It just helps line up this on the inside of the ball. Put a liberal amount of glue around the ball bladder valve, then carefully put the valve through the hole in the pentagon. I then like to quickly pump the ball up. This will show you if you've made any mistakes with the alignment of the ball bladder inside the ball. If you have, you'll need to pull it out and re-glue it. I like this step because you'll really start to get a sense for your future ball. After waiting for a few hours for the glue to dry, you'll be ready to continue. You should be able to get decently close to finishing the ball just by using everything that you've learned so far. The last few panels will take a bit longer than the earlier panels. There's a bit less room to work with, and depending on the material that you're using, it might be hard to put both needles through both layers at the same time. The last panel is the hardest and will probably take you the longest. It's fundamentally the same as all of the other panels though. You'll need to walk through each stitch step by step, one needle at a time, using everything that you've learned so far, going around corners the same way, pulling every stitch through tight just like you have been. The last edge will be the most fiddly, but it also means you're in the home stretch and you're about to get to play with your brand new handmade ball. Keep stepping through the stitches as you approach the final corner. Be very careful not to get anything tangled here, as it's the easiest point in the whole ball to make a mistake, and also the most frustrating. You may need to encourage the panels to fold in on themselves before pulling the thread tight. You can usually just use your fingers to push the edges of the panels in, or if you have a screwdriver or something pointy like a pencil close by, that can also be helpful. Pull that through. Now the same thing on this side. Squeak in here and go through the hole. Pull that through. Now, pull this thread out of the way. Put this needle through the same hole. Pull that through, not all the way. Let's keep a little bit of slack so you can pull this thread out of the way as you put the needle through. There we go. So now gently pull this through. That was officially the last stitch. And I'll do the same thing I have been doing by pushing this whole thing in and pull everything tight. This is usually a good time. If this seam isn't perfect here, just poke in the two edges so that they're kind of nicely going in on themselves. And then once you've poked everything in, pull each of the threads. Now I'll grab them again. And you usually will have like a little protruding area like this, but that's okay. So what you're going to do is tie a knot up against that corner, the slightly protruding corner. 1, 2, So there's now a tight knot there, and I'll cut off the thread quite close to the ball. And then all you have to do is use something pointy. I'm going to use the screwdriver, but you could use a pen or something like that, just to poke in this remaining corner and hide the ends of the thread. So it doesn't take much. And you can even things out by poking the screwdriver through a few of the stitches, just to pull back any of the tension, or even out some of the tension towards the end. And if you've done it correctly, you shouldn't be able to tell where that last corner is. It should be completely invisible. Now comes the fun bit. Look at it! Look at it! It's worth taking a moment to reflect on what you've done here. You've created something from nothing. From a few hours of work, you've made something that has the potential to create many more hours of joy and memories. Boom. And then there you go. You have a brand new ball. Stand back and enjoy watching your brand new ball come to life in front of you. It's not uncommon for a new ball to not be perfectly round for a few moments after you pump it up. I like to give the ball a few maiden bounces, give it a little kick about. If it's still not perfect after a few minutes, deflating and reinflating will usually resolve any issues. And now you're done. You can bask in the glory of the new ball that you've created. If you run into any issues or have questions about any part of the process that hasn't been answered in this video, consider joining the Ball Makers Guild. If you use this tutorial to make a new ball, please share it with the guild. We love seeing new balls. Also consider subscribing to this YouTube channel and following me on Instagram and TikTok. I spend my time prototyping new ball ideas, so it might give you some inspiration for future projects. Thanks.